Vasıf, can you confirm that you're now seeing the full screen? Yes.
Yes, I do.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for attending, and Vasıf and Arwa, thank you very much for having me here. I guess there's a logic to me speaking first on the basis of both geography and chronology. Okay, early colonization of the Aegean Islands and the global origins of seafaring, a relatively large subject, so I will deal with things hopefully relatively generally and accessibly, but I'm more than happy to take more detailed questions at the end. To an extent, our story starts, so I'm just trying to be able to see my own screen and move view screen. Okay. Our story starts over 2 million years ago when we have evidence for the first dispersal of hominins, our early human ancestors, out of Africa into Asia and then eventually hanging left into Europe. This occurred until relatively recently, we thought around 1.9 million years ago, with the earliest skeletal evidence for Homo erectus in Dmanisi at 1.85 million. But excitingly, over the last few years, we've had very early dates of stone tools from India and China, extending back to over 2.5 million years ago. When we look westwards and try to follow the path of most probably Homo erectus through the Levant and through Anatolia into Europe, the Aegean, i.e. modern day Western Anatolia and continental and insular Greece, was until relatively recently seen as a relatively irrelevant area to the contribution of this study. And this is largely, you can see here represented by this map from Sirikov et al. 2010, that the hypothesis for the spread of early humans is meant to be a land bridge one through the Thracian land bridge. The logic for this was the belief until relatively recently that large bodies of water, not least seas such as the Aegean, would have represented barriers to the movement of pre-Homo sapiens populations. By extent, seafaring has become or has long been seen as an index of behavioural modernity. In short, the evidence for seafaring was something globally to be restricted exclusively to Homo sapiens, and our predecessors, on the basis or the logical basis that they were technologically and cognitively incapable of such acts, were thus restricted to terrestrial movements. Hence the fact, the idea that in theory, the only way they could enter Europe was across the land bridge that joined northwest Anatolia and the southeast Balkans. Very rapidly, this whole discussion concerning the origins of seafaring collapses essentially into an archaeology of ego, i.e., what is it that makes us Homo sapiens special? Hopefully by now you're all cognizant of the fact that the image on the lower left, this classic representation of unilinear evolution, is completely wrong, and that our human ancestry is far more complex and much more like this dendritic, tree-like representation that dominates this slide. The key thing about this picture is that we have to appreciate just how bizarre the situation is that for about the last 30,000 years, Homo sapiens are the only human species on the planet. This is completely in contrast to the preceding few million years, when there was always more than one version of humanity, a number of which become evolutionary dead ends or eventually die out, but were at one point contemporaries with us, such as most famously the Neanderthals. So a big, one of the major debates in early human archaeology is what makes us special? Why was it that Homo sapiens survived and all the others died out? What were the winning evolutionary strategies that allowed us to survive? What makes us special? And again, I would argue that early human prehistory is by far the most exciting field in archaeology today. It's wonderful. Every time I come to teach my undergraduates, I get to point out that their textbook is almost invariably out of date. In the last few years, since 2015, we've had the discovery of Homo naledi. We have the Denisovans, we have Homo floresiensis, we have, as of 2018, 2019, Homo luzoensis from the Philippines. So we now know that in the late Pleistocene, there were a number of different versions of humans. We survived. Why was that? So what I'm talking about here is essentially a model, a very black and white model that was put forward a few years ago that highlights all of those things that we believe that only Homo sapiens did and was absent from the archaeological record of the Neanderthals and other characters that presumably reflect our greater cognitive and technological and evolutionary capabilities that ultimately represent these winning strategies. Seafaring was one of them, alongside allegedly art, burial, language, and various other things. However, as anybody who's been following archaeological reportage over the past 20 years should appreciate, things have changed radically. So, since their discovery in the early part of the 20th century, the Neanderthals in particular have had the mother of all PR problems. They were seen for the longest time as the quintessential knuckle-dragging, cave-dwelling brute. These representations we now come to appreciate are based on problematic data and scientific racism, whereby over the last few years, there has been a radical reconceptualization of the Neanderthals, not least their capabilities and their relationship to us, not just chronologically, but in terms of their capabilities. We now appreciate through genetics, through the FOX2P gene, that Neanderthals also had the capability of speech. There is relatively good evidence for the occasional burial practice, an avowedly social act that hitherto is thought to again be exclusive to Homo sapiens. There's evidence for adornments and other forms of symbolic behavior, including alleged indirect evidence for artwork being produced by Neanderthal populations 65,000 years ago in Iberia. There's been something of a rapprochement in terms of bringing the Neanderthals much more closely to us. And over the past 10 to 15 years, there has also been alleged evidence for pre-sapiens seafaring. Once again, critiquing one of these black and white indices of behavioral modernity. Up until this point, only Homo sapiens were allegedly capable of building boats and crossing open bodies of water. The two primary areas we have alleged evidence for this is the Aegean and insular Southeast Asia. Before we go any further on this discussion, I need to return to this map and to remind you of how problematic this map is. Because essentially what you have here is a very familiar image because it's a modern cartography. One of the things we have to appreciate in this debate is the periods we're talking about would have been a very different land and seascape. And we need to really consider that in making our arguments about early sea crossings. So we're dealing with here the Paleolithic. We're also dealing in geological terms with the Pleistocene, better known as the Ice Age. Now, in general terms, the Ice Age, of course, the clue's in the name, was a colder period, but there are fluctuations within the Ice Age, slightly warmer interglacials and then much colder periods. And in those much colder periods, we have large amounts of water being drawn up out of the world's oceans into terrestrial glaciers, which has a significant impact on the sea levels of the time. Indeed, it's been estimated that at the coldest points of the Pleistocene, the Mediterranean would have been 150 meters lower, which would have served to expose huge tracts of land, which would have in turn resulted in a number of bodies of land that today are islands, are insular, being joined by land bridges to continental land masses, either continental Greece or Anatolia in the area we're interested in. So, for example, A bunch of really good work has been undertaken over the last few years by Greek paleogeographers, such as Professor Lykoussis in 2009, which shows, based on bathymetric reconstructions in concert with our understanding of sea levels in the context of the Pleistocene, that at certain cold periods of the Ice Age, it would have been possible to walk from Western Anatolia to continental Greece without having to use the Thracian land bridge, as represented by these two lower images. You probably can't see the scale. The one on the bottom left is between 300 to 250,000 years ago. The one on the bottom right between 480 and 350,000 years ago. A key paper in this whole debate from an Aegean perspective was that written by John Cherry, then of Cambridge University, in 1981 and published in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society, Pattern and Process in the Earliest Colonization of the Mediterranean Islands. This was a fabulous piece of new archaeology, i.e. an attempt by anthropological archaeologists to look for the major patterns in human behavior, cross-culturally, globally, ahistorically, etc. Now, what Cherry was interested in was a history of island colonization throughout the entire Mediterranean to see if there were general patterns in terms of human behavior. Now, up until this point, you had lots of really good scholarship, but somewhat blinkered, somewhat isolationist. So a whole bunch of really good scholars working on Sardinia, a whole bunch of really good scholars working on Sicily, Crete, Cyprus, etc. But the East didn't talk to the West and vice versa. So one of the key things that Cherry spotted in his review was that there was indeed some quite striking patterns. First and foremost, despite the fact that you have well-established Lower Paleolithic or early Stone Age occupation of the continental land masses surrounding the Mediterranean, with occupations dating back over 1 million years in Europe, Asia, and Africa, it would appear that humans didn't get their act together to move into the insular Mediterranean until much, much later. Not until the Holocene, not until Homo sapiens were in town, and not even early Homo sapiens at late. The earliest evidence in 1981 correlated with the early Neolithic. So this is relatively late in even Homo sapiens history. So at that time, the earliest evidence for human activity in the islands or colonization of the islands was Crete, dated back to about 9,000 years ago. The other pattern, apart from this sort of temporality, was that it was the largest islands were colonized first, the largest islands that were indivisible from the mainland. So Crete, Cyprus, and core Sardinia. We won't talk about Sicily because Sicily was still essentially joined to the mainland and not insular at that time. You then have a gradual fleshing out of the islandscape with small islands such as the Cyclades in the Aegean or the Balearics in the Western Mediterranean being occupied later, and the really teeny-weeny islands, places like the small Cyclades, Keros, not until the early Bronze Age. Okay. Now, what's really important about Cherry's argument about the pattern of island colonization in the Mediterranean is that if one steps back, as was undertaken by a review by Clive Gamble, is that this pattern is not just a Mediterranean pattern, but a global pattern. In essence, the birth of seafaring and the birth of island colonization is a phenomenon we associate exclusively with Homo sapiens, late Pleistocene, early Holocene. And indeed, there are other barriers that seem to be transcended at this point. It's not until we have the evolution and the spread of Homo sapiens that it seems that people were capable of living in deserts or in high altitudes or the polar regions. So all of these, you know, this adaptive capability to move across water, to build boats, to move across water, to live in challenging environments, all seems again to sort of, you know, be part and parcel of what makes us special and why we survived and the others died out. So if we return to the archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean, we can see the first wave of hominin dispersal occurring around 1 million years ago. We have good dates from the Levant. Of course, we've got Dmanisi at 1.85 million years ago. In continental Anatolia, we have activity atop Goluda at Kalatepe from somewhere between 800,000 to 200,000 years ago. And then we've got the Homo erectus skull fragment dated to 1.2 million at Denizli, and then up to Kazarnica in Bulgaria to again around 1 million years ago. But if one zooms in to the Aegean, you can see that the dates are really much, much later. Now, there is a risk here in terms of there's been much less archaeological research because, you know, why would one look for, you know, it becomes this kind of catch-22 scenario of you wouldn't attempt to look for early hominins in continental or insular Greece because they're not meant to be there. And so you don't look for them. But, you know, the earliest evidence for human activity in continental Greece, which was only published about a year or two ago, comes from Marathusa, dating back to only 500,000 years ago. So, you know, the archaeological record does seem to suggest that, you know, continental Greece is a bit of a cul-de-sac. It's somewhere you end up in sort of colder periods. But for the earliest spread of humans was an irrelevance, presumably because the sea was a barrier. When we move into the middle Pleistocene and the middle Paleolithic, then we have a lot more evidence for archaeological activity in continental Greece. The artifacts associated with Levallois technique, Mousterian products, etc., we largely associate, if not exclusively associate, with Neanderthal populations. And indeed, we have a little bit of skeletal data relating to Neanderthals down in the Marni, down in the southern tip of the Peloponnese. Greece, along with the Mediterranean coast more generally, probably did very well in the colder periods, whereby they became a more attractive refugium. So we have quite a lot of apparent Neanderthal activity on the mainland of Greece, and of course, over in Anatolia, not least in the Antalya region. Hi there, Metin. Moving forward to the later stage, with the alleged first appearance of Homo sapiens was believed to be around 45,000 years ago with regard to the movement from Anatolia into Europe. And again, as you see from this map reproduced by reproduced from a 1996 paper by the Cambridge prehistorian Paul Mellars, it was again assumed that Homo sapiens would have taken a terrestrial route across the Thracian land bridge. That said, we do know that Homo sapiens was capable of crossing the Wallace line and getting to Australasia around 50,000, if not back to 65,000 years ago. So in theory, Homo sapiens might have been able to cross the waters here, but the received wisdom that once again, it was a terrestrial affair. On the Greek side of things, we have relatively early dates from the Arglid, from the two well-known cave sites of the Frankthi and Klizura caves. It's not, however, until later Homo sapiens, the late Pleistocene, that we have the first evidence for activity in the insular Aegean. This was best evidenced by excavations in the late 1970s and early 1980s at the Frankthi cave, where the American team discovered small amounts of obsidian, elementally characterized as coming from the Cycladic island of Melos. So we're not talking here about true colonization. This period has long been viewed as a period of exploration. Now, even allowing for changes in sea level between the late Pleistocene and today, it's estimated that this trip to Melos would have involved crossing open seas of at least 25 kilometers. But no problem. These are Homo sapiens. They're allowed to do that. And so the received wisdom, again, up to the point of John Cherry's work in 1981, was that true island colonization of the Mediterranean islands, the earliest example of which was allegedly Crete, did not happen until the advent of farming. And potentially the correlation here is that we have the invention of new groundstone technology, polished axe technology that could have, facilitated the cutting down of larger timbers to make the craft that would have been required to colonize what was seen as virgin territory on Crete by migrant Anatolian farming populations around 9,000 years ago. Now, that was the received wisdom up to the point of John Cherry, and indeed throughout most of the 1990s. However, new evidence has come to light that challenges this hypothesis of very late seafaring in the Aegean. And the best quality data initially came from the very southern part of the Aegean, Crete and the island of Gavdos. In 2009 and 2010, we had 3 papers independently publishing what were proclaimed to be stone tools that appeared on the basis of their typology and their technology to be not just a little bit pre-Neolithic and Mesolithic, but actually Paleolithic and Middle and Lower Paleolithic at that, from southwest Crete and the island of Gavdos. Arguably the most important of these 3 articles was that published by Curtis Runnels, Eleni Panikopoulou, and Tom Strasser in 2010 in the journal Hesperia, reporting the material culture from the Plakias survey of southwest Crete. Here they published a large quantity of stone tools that, again, on the basis of what they looked like and how they were made, they proclaimed to be classic Acheulean hand axes and other bifaces of Lower Paleolithic date, which by extent could be as early as 800,000 years ago. And more radically, they also argued that the material didn't look like the Lower Paleolithic technology of Anatolia or continental Greece, but actually looked more similar to North African types. The significance of all of this is that even allowing for those fluctuations in sea level during the Pleistocene, Crete was always an island. Ergo, the people who made these tools had to have got there by boat. And if you believe the work of Runnels, Panikopoulou, and Strasser, this had to happen in the Lower Paleolithic and by extent had to have involved pre-sapiens populations. Game changer. And indeed, this made a very big splash, no pun intended. They were very good at the PR, and the story was picked up by National Geographic, New York Times, etc. Made a very big noise. Now, I have to be clear, all of those data from the Plakias survey, from Lutro, from Gavdos, were all surface artifacts, material that looked like Lower and Middle Paleolithic tools. Now, that's not an uncommon claim. That's the very basis of survey archaeology. But for a lot of people, the evidential quality to make such radical claims needed to be much more robust. The next year, 2011, the Plakias team produced more robust data. Specifically, they gave us scientific dates of archaeological materials eroding out of a secondary deposit. So far from perfect. This is not an excavation. This material is not in situ. It's in secondary context, but the OSL dates gave us a minimum age of 113,000 years ago. Again, the received wisdom at this point is that Homo sapiens are not in the Aegean until 45,000 years ago. Ergo, this had to be pre-Homo sapiens seafaring, going against the received hypothesis as to what constituted behavioral modernity. Maybe our predecessors were a lot more intelligent and capable than we had previously given them credence for, and maybe we're a bit less special. Now, this claim was radical and ruffled a few feathers, and as befits any major new claim, requires some scrutiny and also a certain amount of pushback. Some of the pushback, some of the critique was published and was very responsible and very academic in tone. Unfortunately, I can also tell you off the record that a lot of it was very more damning, and unfortunately those critiques never made it to press. I think, to be honest, there's also a lot of professional jealousy, but we won't go down that road. So what is the basis of the critique? What are the bases of the criticisms of the data from Crete? Well, some people don't even believe the artifacts, inverted commas, from Plakias are even cultural. Some people think they're completely natural. Now, I have to say, in 2010, just after they found this material, I was invited down to go and visit the team, and I got to handle this object on the left, one of their proclaimed Achillean bifaces. And when I held it, I was transfixed. I was very impressed. It was the right shape, the right size, it all felt right. And then at a certain point, I had to stop myself and stare at it really hard to make sure I could see the actual flake scars. Because unfortunately, all of this material is a local quartz, which is anybody who's ever worked with stone tool raw materials appreciates this material is challenging at best, which is a euphemism for it's crap, and often very difficult to see the technical features. I stared at this object and I could maybe see about a third of the features that they believed they could see and were represented in their technical drawings. Now, to be fair, Curtis Runnels has done a lot of work with this material, including working with Mehmet Bey in Anatolia, and has much more experience of working with quartz than I. But I can certainly see why people found this problematic. Also, there were these drawings juxtaposed with photographs, and the two didn't always very much match particularly well. That said, some of the most vociferous people I know who proclaim this material is natural have never even held the material firsthand, which I think is rather unfortunate. But this is a larger problem. I was told a few years ago about a blind test that Ignacio de la Torre from UCL organized amongst a bunch of Lower Paleolithic specialists. He did a blind test making tools out of quartz and mixed it with natural pieces. And these eminent lithic technologists came along and the results were lousy. This is a difficult material to work with. Other people have critiqued the fact that this material is not in context. This is not a proper excavation. It's all in secondary deposition. Absolutely. And they never covered that out. The dates are terminus antiquem. But honestly, if all you want to consider is material in primary context, you're probably getting rid of 75% of the early Stone Age archaeology of Africa. Not everything is the FLK site in Olduvai. And then the third critique, which I do have a certain sympathy with, is the fact that they published their article in Hesperia, which is the in-house journal of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. Now, these scholars felt beholden to their supporting institution to publish their first results in the institution's journal, which I think was a little naive of them, because a lot of scholars felt they were trying to bypass the Paleolithic community. They should have published it in the Journal of Human Evolution or somewhere else and come under much greater rigor. I'm fairly certain that the reviewers for this paper were Paleolithic archaeologists, but I get the fact that the optics of this journal are somewhat lousy. Now, the claims from Crete were then part of a larger number of claims of other alleged Paleolithic artifacts from places that today are islands. Not least some work by an Italian geologist who published in the early 2000s some material from Western Milos that on the face of it looked like classic Oldowan and Achillean tool types. Similarly, alleged Levallois material from the Ionian islands of Kefalonia and Zakynthos. But again, all of this material was surface material. The only people who were excavating at this time was Nina Galanidou, a professor from the University of Rethymno on the island of Lesbos, at a site called the Rhodaphnidia, where they were finding good Lower Paleolithic material. The trouble is, pretty much throughout the Ice Age, Rhodaphnidia was part of Anatolia. It wasn't an island, and by extent, does not contribute to this debate of alleged pre-sapiens seafaring, and only Prevely had produced any dates. So that was essentially the backdrop to our beginning work on the island of Naxos. The site of Stolida, where we've been working since 2013, is situated today on the northwest coast of Naxos, in the central Cyclades and the largest island within this archipelago. The site comprises this distinctive double-peaked hill, whose significance is essentially geological, and it's the geology that produces the archaeology. It's a very neatly defined, but by Southern Aegean standards, very large outcrop of chert, a relatively good quality silicious raw material that makes for excellent stone tool production, not least in the period before the advent of metal technology. In a Southern Aegean context, most of you will probably be much more familiar with obsidian from Milos as being the primary lithic raw material of Aegean prehistory. But now we have material from Stolida. This is what the site looks like. If we have time, I'll come back and show the video, but I don't want to overrun. Now, the site was found by a French survey in 1981, which led to a short and what was intended to be a preliminary publication by Michel Seafaring in 1983. The geology, its color and fracture mechanics were described, as was the fact that the site was littered with stone tools and the debris associated with their production, and was accompanied by some technical drawings of a certain quality that I reproduce here. The issue for Seafaring was one of dating, and this is what confused him. So he tentatively suggested that the site was of Epi-Paleolithic or early Neolithic in date. Why was he tentative in his dating? Well, first and foremost, the material looked nothing like the stone tools that had been found previously in prehistoric sites in the Cyclades, which up until that point were no older than the late Neolithic, as represented by Renfrew's excavations on Saliagos, or all of those wonderful early Cycladic sites and cemeteries we know of. At those sites, 99% of the tools tended to be made from Melian obsidian. None of these sites had produced any stone tools that looked like Stolida chert. Also, the kinds of artifacts that were laying on the site of Stolida didn't really look like the Neolithic and the Bronze Age lamina and arrowhead-oriented industries. So it suggested to Seafaring that maybe then, Stolida was a bit earlier. But, the monkey on his back, the cloud hovering over him was John Cherry, who 2 years previously had said very forcefully that nobody was living in the islands before the late Neolithic in the Cycladic realm, and certainly not before the early Neolithic throughout the Mediterranean. So, Seafaring sort of tried to push it as early as he went, but, to go any earlier would have been completely against the grain of this very well received and very well defended a thesis put forward by Cherry. Anyway, given what was going on Crete, we decided that maybe Stolida was a site worthy of revisiting in the context of these alleged pre-Neolithic and potentially even pre-sapiens populations in the insular Aegean. So we started our project attempting to contribute to these various debates. The work we began in 2013, and it was initially a survey, following well-established Aegean survey methodologies using a combination of transects and grids and standardized recording methodology. We mapped the geology, we mapped the distribution of the artifacts, and collected in this standardized manner over 33,000 items, of which 9,000 we proclaimed to be diagnostic based on their technological and typological characteristics. We argued on these bases that we had evidence for Mesolithic, Upper, Middle, and Lower Paleolithic. The trouble is we ran into exactly the same criticisms that had been leveled at Crete and the Ionian Islands. All of this material was survey material. Just because it looked early didn't necessarily mean it was early. And in particular, at quarry sites, you often get big, chunky waste material that maybe to an untrained eye might look really early Paleolithic, but perhaps could in fact be Neolithic. So we stopped our survey in 2014 and shifted into excavation mode, because John Cherry, Alan Simmons, and various other scholars were arguing that in essence, for anybody to prove a pre-sapiens island population, we'd had to really produce a gold standard of archaeological evidence. First and foremost, this data had to come from excavation. There needed to be an intact stratigraphy. We needed material culture that was absolutely categorically human and not eco-facts. They needed to be associated with scientific dates, and ideally, the moon on a stick to actually have human remains as well. So in 2015 onwards, we started to excavate to try and produce exactly this kind of evidential quality. And at the time, we were pretty much the only project in the entire Mediterranean that was in a location that potentially could have been insular in the Pleistocene. Anything I talk about the project from here on, I should acknowledge the fact that, you know, it's not just my work, of course. I am, in fact, since 2015, co-director of the project. It's now an official collaborative venture between the Canadian Institute in Greece and the Ephorate of Cycladic Antiquities. My co-director is the well-known Byzantinist Dimitris Athanasoulis. And also, I'm lucky enough to be working with a number of senior and junior scholars alike from Greece, from France, from Serbia, from the US, etc., whose hard work contributes to the narrative I'm giving you today. We face a number of challenges at Stolida. The site is a relatively steep hillside, which means that we're talking about an archaeology thousands, tens, potentially hundreds of thousands of years old, which means that the landscape has undergone a lot of changes. We've had the Ice Age, we've had global warming, we've had wind, rain, gravity all at play, a lot of which has basically led to the archaeology moving. And in fact, unfortunately, the vast majority of the archaeology we've dealt with at Stolida is in secondary context. In short, originally the stone tools were probably made at the top of the site and then have washed down the slope. Some of this erosion is so significant that parts of the hill is pretty much exposed bedrock, and some of our trenches, when we start them, they're only about 5 centimeters deep, and then that's it. In other places, however, we have some quite neat sediment traps, natural terraces provided by the outcrops of chert, whereby in certain places we have stratigraphic deposits of 4 to 5 meters depth, all of which are incredibly artifact rich. One of the other challenges we face, unfortunately, is because of the bedrock geology being so alkaline, organic remains, plant remains, bone, etc., despite a very rigorous collection and flotation protocol, this material almost never survives. So it's very difficult for us to reconstruct the paleo environment and also what these characters were eating and using at the times they were there. We are attempting to resolve that issue by turning to the relatively new technique of sedimentary DNA to try and extract the genetic remains of plants, animals, and potentially people from the soils. And that work is ongoing here at McMaster. So who was there at Stolida? What were they doing and when were they there? The latest earlier prehistoric evidence we have for activity at the site is Mesolithic, based on the recovery of significant quantities of stone tools that technologically and typologically have excellent parallels from well-dated excavations elsewhere in the Aegean. And of course, these are Homo sapiens populations. These are the last hunter-gatherers before the incursion of farmers, and should date to around about 9 to 11,000 years ago. The fact that we have a Mesolithic population in the insular Aegean is no longer such a great surprise. Between the work of John Cherry and our own work on Naxos, there have been excavations in the Sporades, in the Cyclades, and the northern Aegean islands, not least by Adiamantos Sampson, proving the presence of late hunter-gatherers in the islands, extending colonization of the islands back to the early Holocene. I have an arrow between the site of Maroulas on Kythnos and Stallida because that's pretty much the only site that we think we know a community using Stallida chert. One of the big questions we struggle with is who is actually coming to the site and where are they taking the raw materials they exploit. We also have significant quantities of Upper Paleolithic material, including significantly quantities of diagnostic aurignation stone tools. Now, in theory, if you're talking about the aurignation or the early aurignation, one should only use that term if one also is finding bone tools, etc. So we have the lithic component of the aurignation. Okay, the significance of that is that for the longest time, the aurignation, which is well represented in the Aegean, we have well-dated deposits from the Argolids, is the period we tend to associate with the first appearance of Homo sapiens in Eurasia. Now, if we go back to the map of Paul Mellars from 1996, we could thus suggest that potentially island hoppings, maritime crossing of the Aegean represented an alternative route of Homo sapiens colonizing continental Greece and moving up into Central Europe. Maybe they weren't just restricted to the Thracian land bridge. More radically, we have evidence for classic Middle Paleolithic types, significant quantities of Levallois and discoidal core technology, Mousterian end products, etc. Until recently, these technologies in Greece would have been exclusively associated with Neanderthals. Now, for us to argue for a Neanderthal presence on Naxos, to a certain extent, isn't hugely radical, given that we have significant quantities of Middle Paleolithic tools, presumably produced by Neanderthals, on the coastlines closest to the Cyclades, through Evia, through Attica, the Argolid, and down into the Peloponnese. It would be radical if it took a boat for the Neanderthals to get to Stallida, but I'll come back to that in a minute. We then also have earlier classic Lower Paleolithic tool types, cleavers, bifaces, Tyac points, Clactonian notches, etc., which could conceivably be associated with pre-Neanderthal populations, potentially Homo heidelbergensis, but that's a story for another day. Now, all of those claims are based on what the tools look like. Where we really need to change the narrative is by adding scientific dates to these sequences. So we have been working with the OSL lab, the optically stimulated luminescence dating laboratory in Bordeaux, not least with a scholar called Tristan, who you see here on the left, who has significant experience working with Middle and Lower Paleolithic sites in Southwest France and Iberia. We have thus far completed a few sondages dating wise, one of which we have recently published from the first trench we excavated, or the first trench we fully excavated on the western flanks of the hill, Trench 1, a sequence that runs some 4 meters deep and provided us with a series of dates relating to the different stratigraphic horizons represented within it. Unfortunately, and this is a very big point, all of the dates we are providing are minimum ages. The technique we use, OSL, dates the last time that stratigraphic horizon, that soil, was exposed to the sun. Unfortunately, all of this soil and all of the stone tools contained within these soils have moved downslope. They are all in secondary context. So what we are dating is not when the stone tools were made, but when they came to be finally deposited and buried. So all of our dates are terminus antiquem. They are minimums. And unfortunately, that has huge ramifications in terms of answering the question, did these early characters come to Stalitha by sea? Unfortunately, at present, it's almost impossible for us to answer that question because we cannot connect our dates to those of the sea level reconstructions. This is what the sea level of the Aegean looked like at specific dates. We do not have specific dates. We cannot say that these people were here at date X. We can only say they were here before date X. So the sequence we've produced so far gives us dates back to at least 200,000 years. The stone tools could be significantly earlier than that, but that is our minimum age. So when we published this in 2019 in Science Advances, we did the responsible thing and we played it careful, and we argued that for sort of activity before 45,000 years ago, which was the date associated with the first Homo sapiens in the region at that time, it probably made sense that Neanderthals and perhaps earlier characters were only intermittently going to Stalitha during those very cold periods when the sea level was sufficiently low to expose a land bridge from continental Greece or from Anatolia. That's not to downplay its significance, because indeed it reminds us that, you know, during these cold periods, we would have had alternative routes of colonization of pre-sapiens populations into Europe. Regions that, you know, ecologically would have probably provided us with a bunch of different challenges, lacustrine environments with different plants, animals, diseases, challenges to be met, to be adapted to, all of which again shows the adaptive flexibility of pre-sapiens populations, which, you know, it wasn't so long ago that you had Steve Kuhn reminding us that we had such an early site atop Goludar showed that Homo erectus was capable of moving through continental Anatolia that previously had been seen as too cold and harsh an environment for such characters. So again, it contributes to that kind of debate rather than at the moment, unfortunately, being able to say that they came by boat. The month that our paper was being processed by the journal for publication, another article was published that arguably changes a great deal of what I've been talking about. In 2019, Katerina Harvati, who's arguably the most important Paleolithic archaeologist from Greece working in the Aegean today, based out of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, published in the most prestigious journal out there, Nature, a reanalysis of two very well-known Pleistocene skulls from the Apithema cave in the Mani of the southern Peloponnese. When these skulls were originally published, one was believed to be a Neanderthal, and the other was believed to be Homo heidelbergensis. Harvati and her team re-examined using new sort of metrical approaches, laser scanning, etc., the skulls, and also did a bunch more work on the stratigraphy and dating. The most crucial thing that came out of this study is that the one of the skulls, and in fact the oldest of the skulls, dated to over 210,000 years ago, was not Neanderthal, but was in fact Homo sapiens, and by far the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens in Europe. No longer was the earliest date for first Homo sapiens in Europe 45,000 years ago, but now over 200,000 years ago. So we need to go back to the story of Homo sapiens. The current understanding is the evolution of Homo sapiens is a pan-African phenomenon, with the earliest dates today being associated with a site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud, dating back to around 300,000 years ago. The received wisdom up until about 2018 was that then the dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa occurred quite a bit later. Some of the earliest dates suggested a crossing of the Arabian region off into Southeast island Asia and into China, and not until later through the Levant, Anatolia, and into Europe. That now has been changed. Well, not only do we have the evidence from the Apithema cave from 210,000 years, but the previous year in 2018, a group of Israeli scholars had published another very early fragment of a Homo sapiens skull dating to 180,000 years ago from the Mislia cave. Now, the chances are that this is a failed colonization. We don't have to push back Homo sapiens occupation, continuously in Europe all this period. And in fact, the Apodemia cave is a great case because the Neanderthal skull, so there's a Homo sapiens skull and a Neanderthal skull, the Neanderthal skull is more recent, suggesting that the Neanderthals then moved back into this area. And ultimately, this was a failed colonization, and the one that really took hold was 45,000 years ago. Nonetheless, it does mean that in theory, the Cretan data, and even potentially, and Crete was always an island, remember, with the Cretan data only being at least 113,000 years. If you're playing this really safe, then you could simply argue, it's these early Homo sapiens. There is no need whatsoever to talk about pre-sapiens seafaring in the Aegean. And indeed, Nena Galanidou, in a review article shortly after the Prevely material was published, said, yes, I think that your stone tools are an earlier Paleolithic, but I don't think they look as old as you think they are. I think they relate to the Sangoan tradition, which is only 200 to 300,000 years ago, which would fit with Homo sapiens in Africa. So where does that leave us in terms of the origins of seafaring and pre-sapiens capabilities? So the Aegean, to an extent, is on the back burner for now. It doesn't provide us anything conclusive with regard to pre-sapiens seafaring. So instead, we have to turn to Southeast Island Asia. Here we have much more robust evidence, not least from the island of Flores, where we have an archaeological site with clear stone tools dated to just over 1 million years ago. Significantly, we have associated bathymetric data showing that Flores was an island at this time. Now, it may only have been separated from continental land masses by about 5 kilometers, but that's still a sea crossing of 5 kilometers by presumably Homo erectus. Homo erectus is the main character who's out there at the time. The thing is, what happens over time is as things get warm and the sea levels rise, that gap between the continent and Flores increases. And at a certain point, there's a tipping point whereby Homo erectus can't actually get home anymore. And they end up being stranded there. And that's probably why you end up with Homo floresiensis going through this process of nanism, which is what happens, as with your pygmy hippos and elephants on Cyprus and Crete, etc., when these populations become more isolated. We also have evidence from Sulawesi and Kalinga dating to over 600 to 700,000 years ago. Now, we don't have any skeletal material associated with these sites, but if the earliest evidence for Homo sapiens is 300,000 years ago, these cannot be modern humans. They have to be pre-sapiens population. All right, so from Southeast Asia at least, we do have some evidence for pre-sapiens seafaring. So what is the significance of these data? These data do not speak for themselves. It's all up to us as archaeologists to read into it the significance. Now, there are a few people out there who begrudgingly accept these data and say, yes, but these are the exceptions that prove the rule. Really, seafaring is a modern human phenomenon. Other people say, no, this is the birth of maritime culture, and seafaring starts with Homo erectus, and we are just simply part of that trajectory. So how does one choose between these two different scenarios? Where do we place the emphasis on all of this? Cyprian Brubank, writing in 2006 from an avowedly Mediterranean perspective, albeit informed by larger global considerations, gave us 3 working titles or concepts. He essentially, without really quantifying it or qualifying the terms, gave us the concepts of seagoing, seafaring, and voyaging. For him, the earliest evidence we have for maritime activity that is likely associated with Homo erectus or perhaps Denisovans, but not modern humans, we can conceptualize as seagoing. It's the initial baby steps. Now, in a recent paper published last year by Gaffney, he has gone and sort of quantified these. And if you look at the earliest evidence for seafaring, Sulawesi, Kalinga, Flores, etc., you're dealing with distances minimum of 10 to 85 kilometers. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that's not insignificant. That involves technological capability, know-how, almost certainly implies language, the communication of these issues. So, you know, we might reduce it to just seagoing, but it's still a fairly significant step in terms of like evolutionary capabilities. Nonetheless, you know, is that to then completely collapse Homo sapiens and Homo erectus capabilities into the same thing? No, it is not. Because if one then looks at the seafaring capabilities of early Homo sapiens, then we're talking about what Brubank refers to as seafaring, which Gaffney now says we're dealing with, you know, distances of a minimum of, you know, almost up to 300 kilometers when we're talking about early Homo sapiens getting to New Guinea or to Madagascar. This is a different kettle of fish. I have no idea how you translate that, Vasıf, sorry. Yeah, this is something above and beyond. So yes, you know, we may have changed things from this very simplistic black and white, we are special because we as Homo sapiens, we're the only ones who do art, burial, seafaring, language, etc. You know, perhaps invariably, such black and white models were doomed to failure. It's much more fuzzy. The waters are much more muddied. But I don't think, as perhaps has been the recent tradition of seeing this evidence for early seafaring or art or language or what have you with Homo erectus or Neanderthal as representing a complete rapprochement between them and us of their capabilities. Ultimately, we were capable of much more. And you know, so maybe, like I said, we don't have this black and white model anymore as to why we survived, but certainly we had the extra capabilities to be the only characters on the planet today. And I will shut up and leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristan. This was amazing. A real eye-opener on a very controversial topic. I'm sure there will be lots of questions at the end. But as part of the educational aspect of the Arva Academy lectures, I will now give you a approximately 10-minute Turkish summary of this talk. Actually, it may last a few more minutes than 10 minutes. And then after this Turkish summary, I hope you will all still be here. And then we will have the Q&A part where Tristan will be answering your questions about his talk. Arva Akademisi'nin kapsamı gereği bir de eğitim özelliğinden yani yola çıkarak konferansın bu kısmında 10 dakika boyunca 10 dakikalık bir süre için konuşmanın Türkçe özetini buradan size sunacağım. Daha çok arkeoloji öğrencilerinin de konuyla ilgili bilgilenebilmesi için. Ege Adalarının ilk kolonizasyonu ve deniz yolculuklarının global kökeni isimli konferansımız. Milyonlarca yıl boyunca süren homininlerin Asya'dan Avrupa'ya yayılımının uzun yıllar boyunca Trakya üzerinden izlenen karayolu boyunca gerçekleştiğine inanılıyordu. Bu inanışın ardında yatan temel sebep bu sapien öncesi toplulukların ancak karayolları üzerinden ilerleyebileceği ve Ege Denizi gibi açık denizlerin aslında bir anlamda onlar için aşılması imkansız engeller olarak düşünülmesiydi. Deniz yolculuklarının modern insan davranışları ile birlikte geliştiği ve üst paleolitikten itibaren karşımıza çıkan bir aşama olduğu düşünülüyordu. Bu bakış açısıyla paralel olarak da Ege ve kıta Yunanistan'ın arkeolojisi erken dönemlerdeki insan göçleri üzerine yürüyen çalışmaların dışında tutulmuş ve bu araştırmalar daha çok Anadolu ve Bulgaristan üzerinden geçen yollar üzerinden değerlendirilmiştir. Ki bu da 1 milyon yıldan daha uzun bir süreci kaplamaktadır. Bu hipotez 2010 yılında Girit Adası'nın güney kıyılarında gerçekleştirilen surveyler sırasında Plakias Survey tespit edilen ve alt paleolitik çağa tarihlendiği düşünülen taş aletlerin keşfiyle yeniden tartışmaya açılmıştır. Plakias'ta keşfedilen taş alet tiplerinden yola çıkılarak günümüzden 800 bin yıl önce Sapiens öncesi denizcilerin Afrika kıyılarından yola çıkarak kuzeye doğru deniz seyahati yaptıkları öne sürülmüştür. 2011 yılında bilimsel yöntemlerle elde edilen bilimsel tarihler, bilinenden en az 113 bin yıl daha eski olan bilimsel tarihlerin ortaya konmasıyla daha da tartışmalı noktaya gelmiştir. Tarihlemesi yapılan bu malzemenin ikincil kontekstlerde ele geçmiş olması olduğunu burada altını çizmemiz gerekiyor. Bu tarihleri kabul etmek, teorik olarak modern davranış biçimlerimizle ilgili temellerin de tekrar gözden geçirilmesi anlamına geldiği için oldukça ilginç ve tartışmalı bir sayfa açmaktadır. Pre-sapiens, sapiens öncesi ve pre-üst paleolitik aktivitelerle ilgili diğer yeni bilgiler her ne kadar da survey malzemelerinden geliyor olsa da Kiklat adalarında, Melos'tan ve kıta Yunanistan'ın batısındaki Ionia adalarında da karşımıza çıkmaya başlamıştır. Lesbos, Midilli Adası'ndaki Rhoda Finidia'da gerçekleştirilen kazılarda alt paleolitiğe ait güzel kanıtlar ele geçmiştir. Dolayısıyla bu yeni bulgular, homininlerin bilişsel ve teknolojik konulardaki kabiliyetleriyle ilgili uzun zamandır doğru olduğuna inanılan bilgilerin Ege Denizi ve çevresindeki yeni araştırmalar ışığında yeniden kurgulanması gerektiğini ortaya çıkarmaya başlamıştır. Bu tür cesur iddialar doğal olarak büyük akademik incelemeler gerektirmektedir ve birçok kişi Sapiens öncesi deniz yolculukları ile ilgili yorumlara katılmaya da bilir. Bu tartışmaların olmazsa olması eldeki verilerin kalitesidir. John Cherry gibi önemli bilim insanları bu tür radikal beyanları kabul edilebilmesi için arkeolojik verilerin altın standartta olması gerektiğini belirtmektedir. Bu tanıma uyabilmek için de bir kapalı, bozulmamış stratigrafik depozitlerde kazılarak açığa çıkarılan, açık bir şekilde insan elinden çıkmış objelerin varlığına ulaşmamız gerekiyor. 2. Buluntuların veya tabakanın teknolojik ve tipolojik yöntemlerle değil, bilimsel yöntemlerle tarihlendirilmesinin yapılması gerekiyor. 3. İdeal olarak taş aletlerle direkt ilişkili bir şekilde hominin kalıntılarının bulunması gerekiyor. Ve 4. Batimetrik çalışmalarla bu sitin o dönemde ada şeklinde olması gerektiğinin ortaya konması gerekiyor. Denizcilik faaliyetlerinden bahsedebilmemiz için. Örneğin Lesbos adasındaki Rhoda Finidia Paleolitik dönemde Anakara'ya, Anadolu Anakarası'na bağlıydı ve bir ada konumunda değildi. Ancak Girit'in Pleistosen dönemde her zaman bir ada konumda olduğunu ve hiçbir anakaraya bağlantısı olmadığını biliyoruz. İkisi çok farklı, o yüzden değerlendirilmesi gerekiyor. 2013 yılında Tristan Carter başkanlığında bir ekip Stelida Naxos Arkeoloji Projesi'ni SNAP başlatarak Kiklat adalarının en büyüğü olan Naxos'un kuzeybatı kıyısındaki Stelida sitinde bulunan çakmak taşı kaynaklarının tanımlamasının yapılması ve bununla bağlantılı olarak da aynı alanda alet üretim artıklarının karakterizasyonunu yapmaya başlamıştır. Stelida 1981 yılında keşfedilen ve ilk değerlendirmelerde erken Neolitik veya epipaleolitik döneme tarihlenen bir alandır. Devamında gerçekleştirilen kurtarma kazılarında alanda ele geçen taş aletlerin tipolojileri ışığında buranın Orta Paleolitik'ten Mezolitik'e kadar uzanan bir süreçte insan aktivitesine ev sahipliği yaptığı anlaşılmıştır. Bu bilgiler ışığında Stelida'nın Sapiens öncesi deniz yolculukları konusunda yapılacak bir araştırma için çok uygun bir araştırma alanı olduğuna inanılmış ve çalışmalara bu perspektifle başlanmıştır. SNAP projesinin ilk aşamasında bir survey gerçekleştirilerek alan yüzeyinin haritalandırılması ve buluntuların dağılımı yapılmıştır. Bu çalışma sırasında belli bir standart doğrultusunda alanın daha malzeme toplanmış ve bu maddi kültür kalıntılarının dağılımı yapılarak toplanan taş aletler ışığında sitin tarihlendirilmesi yoluna gidilmiştir. Karakteristik taş aletler yardımıyla alanın alt paleolitik ve mezolitik'e tarihlendirilmesi yönünde öne sürülen iddialar daha önceki örneklerde de görülen tenkitlerle karşı karşıya kalmıştır. Buna göre malzemeler erken görünmesine karşın bilim dünyası bunların söz konusu dönemlere tarihlendirilmesiyle ilgili bilimsel yöntemlerle yapılacak tarihlendirmelere ihtiyaç duyuyor tabii ki. Ve bu durum karşısında 2015 yılında da Kanada Enstitüsü ve Yunanistan Kültür Bakanlığı'na bağlı Kikran Eforeli ile ortaklaşa yeni bir çalışma başlayarak survey çalışmalarının arkeolojik kazılara dönüştüğünü Stelida'da görüyoruz. 2015 yılından bu yana Stelida Tepesi'nin her iki yamacında ve bugün kıyı ovası olarak tanımlanan alanda bir dizi sondaj çalışması yürütülmektedir. Tepe erozyon nedeniyle büyük ölçüde arkeolojik malzemeden arınmış durumdaysa da yer yer 5 metre yüksekliğinde sedimanların birikimini sağlayan bazı alanlarda tespit edilmiştir. Maalesef kazılar sırasında ulaşılan kontekslerin büyük bir çoğunluğu ikincil kontekslerden oluşturmaktadır. Örneğin tepenin üst kısmında üretilen aletler ve üretim artıkları binlerce yıl içerisinde erozyonla yamaçtan sürüklenmiş ve daha alt kesimlerde ele geçmiştir. Stelida'daki kazılar sırasında buluntu açısından zengin bir dizi konteks açığa çıkarılmıştır. Bu kontekstler içerisinde ele geçen 200 bine yakın buluntu üzerinde çalışmalar yapılmış ve bu çalışmaların sonucu olarak bölgesel teknotipolojik terimlerle Mezolitik, Üst Paleolitik ki bunun içerisinde ilk modern insanların Avrupa'ya gelişiyle bağlantılı Orinyasyen malzemeler de bulunmaktadır. Orta Paleolitik ki bu malzeme içerisinde Avrupa'daki Neandertal topluluklarla bağlantı içinde değerlendirilebilecek Lovalva tekniğinde yapılmış aletler bulunmaktadır. Ve son olarak da alt erken Orta Paleolitik'e tarihlenebilecek malzemeler ele geçmiştir. OSL tekniğiyle yapılan bilimsel tarihlendirmeleri günümüzden en az 200 bin yıl önceye giden tarihler vermiştir. Maalesef bu tabakada tamamen ikincil kontekstler içerdiği için elde edilen bu tarihler malzemenin aslında toprak altında kaldığı dönemin tarihlerini vermekte. Yani bunların üretildiği dönemin tarihlerini vermemektedir. Bu durumda elde edilen tarihler olabilecek en geç tarihi vermektedir. Bu durumda terminus antiquum olarak adlandırabiliriz ve arkeolojik malzeme çok daha eski bir tarihe ait olabilir. Elde edilen tarihlerin çok büyük ihtimalle malzemelerden daha yeni olması, Stelida üzerindeki insan aktiviteleriyle Pleistosen dönemler ilgili deniz seviyesi rekonstrüksiyonları arasında bir korelasyon yapılması önünde de büyük bir engel olarak durmaktadır. Az önceki haritalarda da bunu gördük. Buzul çağında hava sıcaklıkları ve deniz seviyesiyle ilgili büyük dalgalanmalar olduğu biliniyor. Buna bağlı olarak da daha soğuk dönemlerde deniz sularının karasal buzullara dönüştüğü ve Akdeniz'in en soğuk dönemlerde bugünkünden yaklaşık 150 metre daha sığ bir deniz olduğu ortaya konmuş durumdadır. Bu bilgiler ışığında Tristan Carter ve ekibi Stelida'nın Pleistosen dönemde Neandertaller ve olasılıkla da erken homininler tarafından çeşitli aralıklarla ziyaret edildiğini öne sürebileceğini düşünmektedirler. En soğuk dönemlerde karayollarının açığa çıktığı zamanlarda Anadolu ve kıta Yunanistan arasında yürüyerek Stelida'ya ulaşılabilmekte ve buradaki çakmak taşı kaynaklarının kullanılmış olabileceği düşünülmektedir. 2019 yılında Tristan Carter ve ekibinin Stelida'nın bu erken dönemindeki kullanımı ile ilgili makalelerinin yayınlandığı ay, Katerina Harvati ve ekibinin kıta Yunanistan'da Güney Peloponez'de Apidimia mağarasında ele geçen iki kafatasının yeniden tarihlenmelerinin ve tanımlamalarının yaptıkları bir makale Nature dergisinde yayınlanmıştır. Bu makalede öne sürülen ana nokta Homo sapiens kafatasının 200 bin yıl önceden daha eskiye tarihlenmiş olmasıdır. Ve 2019 yılındaki bilgilerimiz modern insanların günümüzden 45 bin yıl öncesine kadar henüz Güneydoğu Avrupa'ya ulaşmamış olduğu yönündeydi. Ve bu kafataslarının tarihlendirilmesiyle bölgenin Homo sapiens tarafından erken dönemlerdeki kolonizasyonunun başarısız olduğuna işaret edildiği düşünülmektedir. Çünkü bunun bir sürekliliği henüz yakalanmamış durumda. Ama teorik olarak olaya yaklaştığımız zaman da Girit'te Plakias bölgesinde keşfedilen erken denizcilik aktivitelerinin aslında modern insanlarla bağlantılı izler olabileceği anlamında taşımaktadır. Yani bir anlamda başladığımız yere geliyoruz. Ege Denizi, Sapiens öncesi denizcilerin varlığı konusunda yorumların yapıldığı tek bölge değildir. Güneydoğu Asya'daki araştırmalar da bu tartışmaların odak noktasını oluşturmaktadır. Bu bölgede o zamanlar ada oldukları kesin olan bölgelerde günümüzden 600 bin yıldan 1 milyon yıl önceye kadar Sulawesi, Kalinga ve Flores, az önce haritada da yerlerini görmüştük. Bu kadar geriye giden insan izleri bulunmuştur ki bu dönemler günümüzden yaklaşık 300 bin yıl önceye tarihlediğimiz ilk modern insanlardan çok daha erken dönemlere aittirler. Bu durumda toparlayacak olursak tüm bu veriler bize neyi söylüyor? Erken dönemlerdeki denizcilik faaliyetlerini ele alacak olursak erken homininlerin bilişsel ve teknolojik yetenekleriyle ilgili olarak onların aslında düşündüğümüzden çok daha gelişmiş olduklarını söyleyebilir miyiz? Evet, söyleyebiliriz. Bu artık onlarla aramızdaki biz ve onlar şeklindeki ayrımı ortadan kaldırabileceğimiz anlamına geliyor mu peki? Hayır, büyük ihtimalle böyle bir şey diyemeyiz şu aşamada. Çünkü homininlerin denizlerde seyahat edebilme kapasitelerinin boyutlarında önemli farklılıklar bulunmaktadır. Az önce örneklerini gördüğümüz bu seagoing ve seafaring kelimeleri arasındaki farklılığı burada altını çiziyor. Ve buna bağlı olarak da Homo sapiens'in çok daha uzun mesafeler kat edebilmesi ve karşılaşılan zorluklarla çok daha iyi bir şekilde baş edebilmesinin önemli farklılıklar yarattığını görüyoruz. Sonuç olarak evrimsel adaptasyonlar konusundaki başarısı Homo sapiens'in bugün dünya üzerinde yaşayan tek insan grubu olmasını sağlamıştır.